I saw that shouldn't. But what frightened me wasn't the beginning. It was the fact that I was already old. Thomas Brennan woke at 3:47 a.m., his sheets soaked through with sweat that had nothing to do with the Chicago summer. His apartment was cold, the air conditioning humming its mechanical lullaby, but his body burned with a fear that existed only, or perhaps in his memory. He could never tell the difference. The vision had come again, stronger this time, more detailed, more impossible. He sat up slowly, his hands trembling as he reached for the glass of water on his nightstand. 42 years old, reasonably healthy, no history of seizures or psychological disorder. His last medical checkup had been clean. Dr. Morrison had even commented his excellent cognition. Yet here he was, night after night, experiencing something that shattered every law of human conscience. Thomas walked to the bathroom, avoiding reflection. When he finally forced himself to, he saw what he always saw. A man in his early 40s, dark hair beginning to gray at the temple, tired eyes that held too many questions, ordinary, unreal. But the vision lingered behind his pupils like a photograph burned his retina. In the vision, he was in a delivery, St. Catherine's Hospital, though he couldn't explain how he. The fluorescent lights were too bright, casting everything in a sterile. He could hear his mother's labored, the urgent voices of nurses, the methodical beeping of monitor. But his perspective was wrong. He wasn't viewing this as a memory should be viewed from the safe distance of time. He was there, conscious, aware, and he was looking at himself. A mirror had been positioned incorrectly, angled toward the delivery bed. In it, he saw his own, but it wasn't the face of a newborn. It was the face of an old man, 70, perhaps 80 years old. Deep wrinkles carved into skin, canyoned stone. Eyes clouded, yet somehow sharp with terrible, thin, white hair plastered to a skull that had seen too many. That face looked back at him with recognition, with knowing, with profound sadness. Then came the sound that haunted his own first cry. But it sounded less like a baby's wail and more like an old man's final breath being. Thomas gripped the bathroom sink until his knuckles turned white. He had researched this obsessively. False memory, confabulation, dacio, even psychotic break. Nothing. The vision wasn't fragmented. It was crystal clear, more vivid than his actual childhood. It had text weight. 3 months ago, it had started as a whisper a feeling of wrongness, of temporal displacement. Now it consumed him at night, growing stronger, more insistent, as if whatever had been suppressed was finally clawing its way to the surface. He returned to his bedroom and opened. The screen's blue glow illuminated his face as he typed the same search he typed 100 times before. Memories of birth, consciousness during delivery, temporal anomaly in human development. The results were always the same. Medical impossibility, New Age nonsense, nothing that explained what he was experiencing. But tonight, something buried on the 7th page of Search was a forum post he'd never seen, posted just hours ago. The title made his breath catch. Others who remember being born old. Thomas clicked the link with a finger that wouldn't stop. The post was brief, almost cryptic. If you've seen your own begin, and it terrified, not but because of what you already were, you need to know you're not alone. We exist in the spaces between cause and effect. Some of us are ready to understand why. St. Catherine's Hospital, Chicago, room 247. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. Come only if you're certain, because once you know, you can never. Thomas stared at the screen until his vision. St. Catherine, the same hospital from his vision. The hospital where he'd been born 42 years ago. Where, impossible, he had already. He closed the laptop and lay back down, knowing sleep wouldn't. Tomorrow, he would. Tomorrow, he would finally understand why his beginning felt so much like an ending. Why his birth felt like a return. Why, when he looked in the mirror, He sometimes saw the echo of a man who had already lived the life Thomas was only now experiencing. Thomas arrived at St. Catherine's Hospital at 1:45 p.m., 15 minutes early. The building looked different than it had, renovated and modernized, but the bones were the same. He could feel it in his chest, a recognition that bypassed logic and settled directly into his nervous. He had been here before, not as a visitor, as something else entirely. Room 247 was in the old wing, the section that hadn't been updated. The hallway smelled of disinfectant and something underneath, something old, decay, pretending to be clean. Thomas's footsteps echoed against linoleum that had seen decades of birth, deaths, and everything between. He reached the door and hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. Once he opened this door, something changed. He could feel the weight of that certainty pressing against his sternum. He pushed it open. The room was empty, except for a single woman standing by the window. She was in her mid-50s, with silver-streaked auburn hair pulled back bun. She wore a white lab coat over dark clothing, and when she turned to face him, her eyes held the same haunted awareness. He saw his own every. "Thomas Brennan," she said. It wasn't a question. "You were born here, March 14th, 432. You weighed 7 pounds, 2 ounces. You didn't cry for the first. The nurses thought you were stillborn." She paused, studying. "But you weren't dead. You were just remembering." Thomas felt his legs. "Who are you?" "Dr. Helena von, neuroscience. I've been studying cases like yours for 7 years." She gestured to a folder on the small desk behind her. "Sit, please. I know what you're experiencing, feel. I'm here to tell you it's not." Thomas moved to the chair mechanic, his body operating on autopilot while his mind struggled to process. "Cases like mine, there are 47 documented cases in the United States. Probably hundreds more worldwide who haven't come forward or don't understand what's happening." Helena opened the folder, revealing pages of medical record, brain scan, handwritten note. "We call it reverse temporal consciousness, RTC. Your awareness doesn't move forward through time linearly like most. It moves backward, or rather, it exists in both directions simultaneously. That's impossible, is it?" Helena pulled out a photograph and placed it in front of her. It showed a newborn in a hospital. The image quality was poor, grainy, from an older camera. But Thomas recognized the baby's face immediately. It was him, and in the reflection of the bassinet's metal frame, barely visible, was the distorted image of an elderly man. Thomas's hands began. "How did you get this?" "Your mother gave it, Eleanor. I interviewed her 4 years ago when I first learned about. She's in a care facility, early onset Alzheimer's. But before her memory deteriorated completely, she told me everything about you. The silence, the open eye, the way you looked at her as if you already knew her, as if you'd known her entirely." Helena leaned forward. She said the most terrifying thing, wasn't it? Was that you looked disappointed, as if you'd hoped this time would be different. The room seemed to tilt. Thomas gripped the edge of the desk. "This time, that's the question, isn't it?" Helena closed the folder. "Why does your conscious remember being old when you were born?" The simplest answer, the one I've spent nearly 2 decades trying to prove, is that you've done it. Not reincarnation, not past life, something else. Something that breaks causality itself. She stood and walked back to the window. "There's a group, others like you. They call themselves the Recall. They meet every month. They share their experience, their memories of beginnings that feel like ending. And Thomas, they've discovered something that might explain why it is happening." "What did they discover?" Helena turned back to him, and for the first time he saw fear in her. "Real. That you're not moving backward time. You're moving backward. And some of you are running out of time to live, already reached your own." The recall met in a basement beneath a used bookstore. a neighborhood on Chicago's Lower West Side, where questions were cheaper than up. Thomas followed Helena down narrow stair that creaked with each step, the air growing cooler and damper as they descended. At the bottom, a heavy door with no marking waited. Helena knocked 3 times, then twice. The door opened to reveal a space that felt like a support meeting crossed with a scientific laboratory. Folding chairs arranged in a circle. A whiteboard covered in equations and timelines that curved back. Chart showing brain activity patterns that looked wrong. Neuron firing in sequence that shouldn't. And people, 11 of them, ranging in age from early 20 to late 60, all watching Thomas with expressions that mirrored his own perpetual. Everyone, Helena said, this is Thomas Brennan, born 19. RTC manifestation began 3 months. A man 30 stood up. He had kind eyes, but the posture of someone carrying invisible market. Born 1990. My manifestation started 2 years. He gestured to an empty chair. Welcome to the club nobody wants to join. Thomas sat, feeling the eyes of the recalled on him. A young woman with dark circles under her eyes that suggested weeks of poor sleep spoke. I'm Sarah Chen, 26. I've been experiencing RTC for 8 months. She twisted a ring on her finger. I remember being born with arthritis. I was 3 minutes old, and I could feel decades of pain in joints that had never been. Around the circle, others shared theirs. David Martinez, who remembered his birth and felt the exhaustion of a life in muscle never. Patricia Kowalski, who was born with the taste of medication she wouldn't take for another 60, still bitter on her. James Freeman, who opened his newborn eyes and recognized his mother's face from a funeral he hadn't attended. Each story was a variation on the same possible. They all remembered their birth. They all remembered being old and tired. They all lived with the creeping certainty that they weren't aging forward, but returning, unwinding toward some terminus they couldn't see, but could feel approaching with every passing. The pattern, Helena said, moving with the white, is consistent across all. Your consciousness doesn't exist in linear time. Think of life as a film. Most people experience frame by frame, moving. You're experiencing it in reverse, or perhaps simultaneous from both ends. You remember your ending because you've already lived it. You're not building toward death. You're dismantling. Thomas felt his throat tighten. Then what happens when we reach the beginning? When we finally get to the moment we were actually born, without the memory of being old. The room went silent. It was Marcus who finally answered, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 members of this aren't here. They didn't die. They just stopped existing. One day they were here, the next nobody remembered. Not their family, not their friend. It's like they were erased from the timeline. We only remember them because we're like them. We exist outside the normal. We think, Helena continued, that when you reach your true beginning, when the reverse sequence complete, you don't die, you cease. The timeline corrects itself. You were never born because you already finished. Causality reset. Sarah leaned forward, her voice cracking. We're not living, Thomas. We're unliving. And some of us are running out of life. Some of us are very close to our true birth, which means we're very close to never having existed. Thomas looked around the circle at the faces he called, and he finally understood the fear in their eyes. They weren't afraid of death. They were afraid of being of reaching their beginning and discovering it was actually their end. Of the ultimate question that kept them awake. What happened to someone who's never? Thomas didn't sleep for 3 days after meeting the recall. He spent those 72 hours in his apartment, surrounded by notebooks filled with observations questions he couldn't answer, and a growing certainty that his life was a countdown he'd never realized. On the 4th day, he found the diary. put it was in a box he'd never opened, stored in the back of his closet behind winter and forgotten belongings. The box was labeled in his mother's handwriting, Thomas Baby. He'd received it 5 years ago when she moved into the care facility, but he'd never looked inside. Now, driven by an compulsion he couldn't name, he tore it open. Beneath baby clothes and a hospital bracelet was a leather-bound journal. The cover was worn, the pages yellow. Thomas opened it with trembling hands, and the handwriting he recognized, the specific way he formed, the slight rightward slant, the distinctive loop in his lowercase. But the hand that had written these words shook with pausing. The ink was unsteady, the letters occasionally trailing off, as if the writer's strength had failed midway. The first entry was dated March 14, 2040. 60 years in the future. 60 years he hadn't lived, or had he? Today I turn 80, the entry began. Or I turn. I can never tell the difference. The doctors say I have weeks. They don't understand that weeks for me means something entirely different. Every day I live is a day closer to my birth. Every breath takes me backward. I'm not dying, I'm arriving, and I'm terrified of what I'll find when I get there. Thomas flipped through the pages, his heart hammering against his entries from 2040, 2041, 2040, each one written in that same trembling, each one describing a life he recognized but hadn't, a career as an architect, a marriage to a woman named Claire, who left him because he kept talking about living backward, a daughter named Emma, who he loved desperately, but who grew increasingly distant as his obsession with temporal displacement consumed. Then he found the entry that stopped his heart completely. December 3rd, 2031. I met the others, the recall. They confirmed what I've always known in my bone. I'm not crazy. I'm not having delusion. I am literally living my life in reverse sequence. Dr. Voss showed me the brain scan. My neurons fire back. Cause and effect are inverted and temporal. Every choice I make doesn't create my future, it erases it. She asked me if I understood what that meant. I do. It means I'm not building. I'm dismantling. And somewhere at the end of this reverse journey, at my true beginning, I will cease. The timeline will correct itself. I will be unnamed. Thomas dropped the journal, his hands numb. He had written those words. His future self had lived through everything described in those pages and had documented all, knowing that his past self would eventually find. But why? What was the point of leaving a record of a life that would be? He picked up the journal again, hand shaking, and flipped to the last entry. The date was tomorrow. The handwriting was even more unsteady, barely legible. To my younger self, Thomas, you're reading this now, which means you've found the recall. You've met Helena. You're beginning to understand. There's something I need to tell you, something I discovered. The man you'll meet in Montana, the one who claims to be your older self, is lying. Or rather, he's telling a truth that's incomplete. We're not just living backward. We're being pulled backward. Something at the beginning is calling it. And Thomas, it's not random. We did something, or we will do something. Something that broke causality itself. The only way to stop it is to remember what we haven't done. The cabin in Montana holds the answer. Go there, find him. But whatever you do, don't trust everything he says. Because the oldest version, he made a choice that damned us all reverse, and you need to unmake that before you. The cabin sat at the edge of nowhere, 3 hours outside Missoula, Montana, where the forest grew so thick that sunlight struggled the ground. Thomas had driven for 2 days straight, the journal on his passenger like a bomb waiting to detonate. Helena had given him the coordinates, reluctant, warning him that what he'd find there changed everything. She was right. The man who answered the door was ancient, 90 years old, perhaps older. His skin hung loose on bones that seemed too fragile to support even their own. But his eyes were sharp, unnerving, and when they locked onto Thomas, recognition flashed across his weathered face. "You came," the old man. His voice was rough, damaged by decades. "I wasn't certain. Causality gets fuzzy. I remember you coming, but I also remember you not. Both timelines exist until—" "Are you me?" Thomas asked, though he already knew. The old man's face, beneath all those years, was his own. "I'm what you'll become, or what you were, or what—" The tenses don't work. The old man stepped aside. "Come in. We don't have much time. For you, I mean, for me, time is almost gone entirely." Inside, the cabin was sparse. A bed, a table, a single chair. The walls were covered in paper, equations, timelines that twisted back on themselves in impossible. At the center of it all was a photo. Thomas moved closer, his breath catching. It showed him his current self standing in what looked like a laboratory, his hand on a lever, his face twisted with determination. "That's the moment," the old man said quietly. "The moment we broke every—" January 7, 2027. You won't remember it yet because you haven't done it. But I remember it from the end. I remember standing, pulling that lever, believing we were saving who? Emma, our daughter. She was dying. Neurological. No cure. We were desperate. We worked at a temporal research, classic, government funded. We thought we could pull her consciousness backward, away from the death that was. We thought we could give her more time. The old man's hands trembled. We succeeded, but not in the way intended. We didn't pull her back. We pulled ourselves, all of us, everyone connected experiment. We shattered the temporal sequence. We became the anomaly. Thomas felt the flaws beneath Emma. In the journal I wrote about, she's why causality, and she's the only way. The old man moved to the window, staring out at the dying. But fixing it means accepting that we can never save. It means letting her die in 2027 the way she was supposed. It means choosing her death over ours. That's impossible. I can't kill. The old man turned, and Thomas saw tears streaming down. You already. Every day you live backward is a day choosing yourself. The universe is trying to correct what but it can't do it while we have to stop. We have to go back to our true birth and let the time reset. We have to choose to never have. It's the only way she gets. Thomas staggered backward, his mind fractured. How do I stop it? You go back to St. Catherine's Hospital, room 240, where you were born, and you accept the ending that's really a beginning. You let yourself see, and when you do, causality, Emma will live, and we will have never existed to break time. Thomas stood in room 247 of St. Catherine's Hospital at 4:32, the exact time of his birth. 42. The room was supposed to be scheduled for demolition in 3 days, but it wasn't. Helena, Marcus, Sarah, all of the recalled had come to witness what they knew was inevitable for all of. You don't, Helena, though her voice carried no. They both knew that wasn't. Thomas looked down at his hand. They were beginning to fade at the edges, becoming transient. The reverse sequence was accelerating. He could feel it in his bone, in his blood, in the very fabric of his existence. He was approaching his true beginning, and his body was already starting to see. I saw her, he said quietly. Emma, in my mind. I can remember her now. All her first step, her first word, her diagnosis, her final day. I remember holding her hand in that hospital, watching her slip away, and feeling so powerless. I remember thinking I would do anything to save her. Anything. He looked, and I did. I broke time itself. I shattered, and I've been paying for it ever since, living my life in unwinding toward this moment. The room was the same as in hidden, the same fluorescent light, the same position. Someone had even placed a mirror at the exact angle. Thomas walked toward his reflection, growing clearer with each step. But it wasn't his 42-year-old face staring back. It was older, 60, 70, 80. The years he'd lived backward were showing themselves in reverse. His face aging as he approached. "What happened, Sarah?" Her voice. "What happens to all of the recalled when you reset the time?" "I don't know, Thomas. Maybe you ceased. Maybe only I. Maybe the timeline splits and we all continue in some other branch of reality. Or maybe Emma lives and we never existed to become." He stood in front of the mirror, and his reflection was ancient. The face from his vision. The face he'd seen on the day he was born, staring back at profound, sad. But now he understood that sad, it wasn't despair. It was acceptance. It was the recognition that some prices must, some choices must be some lives must be unlived, so that others. "I'm sorry," Thomas whispered. "I'm sorry I tried to keep you when the universe is time. I'm sorry I broke everything because I couldn't accept. But I'm going to fix it now. I'm going to give you back the life I stole when I tried to pull time." He closed his eyes. He could feel the moment approaching. His truth. The instant when cause and effect would reckon. When the timeline would heal itself. When Thomas Brennan would cease to have ever been born. Because the version of him that broke causality would never exist to make that. The room grew brighter, or perhaps darker. He couldn't tell anymore. Time had lost all. He felt himself unwinding, unmade, erased. He felt his memories dissolving like sugar in water. His childhood, his career, his desperation, his choice. All of it fading, all of it being. The last thing he remembered was a sound. A baby, pure, clear, and untainted by the weight of years lived. It was his first and only. The cry he should have given 42 years ago, but couldn't because he'd been born already old, already tired, already finished. And then there was silence. In a hospital room somewhere, a woman named Emma Brennan woke from a coma. The doctors called it a miracle. Her father, who had been sitting by her bedside, wept. In a basement, the recalled gathered and felt something shift their conscience. A lightning, as if a weight they'd carried for years had suddenly. They looked at each other, confused, trying to remember why they were what they'd been. And in room 247 of St. Catherine's, scheduled for demolition, the morning light filtered through and no one remembered that room no one remembered the man who had stood there, accepting his unmaking, so that causality. No one remembered Thomas Brennan, because he had finally reached his beginning, and in reaching it, he had never been born. Cause and effect reckoned. The timeline by, and a baby who should have cried 42 years ago finally gave breath, unmarked by the burden of a life lived back, free to exist in a simple forward mark of time.